Michigan's Children proudly presents Speaking for Kids, the podcast where we explore crucial conversations impacting the lives of all Michigan children, youth, and families, especially the most vulnerable. Join us each month as we explore public policies and issues in the best interest of our kids and families. We'll bring you lawmakers and policymakers, advocates fighting for change, and the people most affected by those decisions. With our host, Matt Gillard, President and CEO of Michigan's Children, we'll invite you to become engaged too and show you how to take action on what matters most to you. Episodes are recorded live and shared virtually on YouTube and the audio hosting sites Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Hello, and welcome back to another edition of Speaking for Kids, the podcast from Michigan's Children. I'm Matt Gillard, your host and the president and CEO of Michigan's Children. In today's episode, we're going to take a look back at what the legislature accomplished for kids and families in 2023, and maybe take a peek into the crystal ball for maybe what should and could get done in the new year. And to help us do that is our guest today, Alethia Kasben. She's the managing editor of Gongwer News Service. Alethia has been with Gongwer for over 12 years, first as an intern and then as a Capitol reporter covering the House of Representatives for over 8 years. Today, she oversees all of Gongwer's news coverage and serves as senior legislative reporter for Gongwer. Alethia, you've had a longer run at the Capitol than a lot of the folks who have been in office during those periods. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
All right, so let's get right into it. So, Alethia, from your vantage point, really, what do you think the legislature really did deliver on? Obviously, it was a new dynamic. I think there was a lot of excitement in interest from those of us advocates, especially to see what would happen with the first Democratic majority in 40 years with a Democratic governor. And combined with the fact that there was a big state surplus, if you think back to, at this time last year, heading into 2023 with a bunch of federal money still kind of left over from the ARPA funds and all this promise and expectation. So what were kind of the overall themes from your standpoint covering this on a daily basis that you saw from the legislature, especially as it relates to the issues that Michigan's Children focuses on?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it was definitely a busy year. Even with the legislature leaving a little bit early, when they were in for long days with, lots of big ticket items getting done. In terms of, what they did for children's and families, I think one of the biggest things from this year and something, Democrats had talked about since, I think 2011 when this happened was expanding the earned income tax credit, which the governor has now decided to call the working families tax credit. But I think most of us know it as the EITC. It was under former Governor Rick Snyder brought down to, I believe, 6% of the federal credit. It had been 20. They pushed that up to 30%. In terms of like a long-term issue, something that really gets to, lower income working people, usually people with families, that's going to be, a big boost, I think, this year. The governor announced yesterday that, this bill didn't get immediate effect for a variety of reasons that I won't get into here. So, people didn't get this expansion in their taxes that they filed last year. So, the people who qualify will get that check outside of their taxes, before tax season really goes up this year. So I think that, was a big thing. And, there were more. I don't know if you want to.
Sure. No, well, let's talk about that for a minute. Let's dig in a little bit because EITC it is a big accomplishment and something that, the governor is touting and I think the legislature is touting and should be. But it was kind of an interesting issue as well. It was a bipartisan vote ultimately. And in fact, the effort to expand the EITC or to bring back the EITC actually started with some Republican support, even under the Snyder administration, at least in the term before, not the Snyder administration necessarily, but in the term before the Democrats took control. Senator Wayne Schmidt at the time was a big champion, Republican from Traverse City. And so, it was, like I said, it was a good thing, something Michigan's Children was certainly, out front on and very supportive of. But it was a bipartisan issue to some extent and had, fairly broad business community support and other things that you see typical from the Republican side. The other interesting part of that you hinted at, and this was kind of a theme, I think, throughout the year, was the immediate effect and the challenges with getting immediate effect on some of these measures that ultimately led the legislature to end session early in November. And we don't need to get too far into the weeds on that. we'll spare our listeners that kind of legislative sausage grinder details. But the EITC kind of stood out both, I think, as one of the big things that happened, but also the fact that it, had some at least bipartisan appeal to it, where a lot of the other things, it seemed like the wheels kind of fell off that bipartisan bus maybe after the EITC went through. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the EITC is a really interesting issue when you talk about, bipartisanship, because it was slashed under, Republican control. A lot of Republican legislators who voted, to decrease the EITC eventually were like, we do support raising it back up. We did this because of the budget situation at the time. And, we had to make some difficult decisions. So even Republicans who voted for it were like, yes, now the state is in a better position. We need to get this, back to where it was and then some. But because the way that they packaged this bill and the way politics works, they put the EITC in a larger bill that included several other things that Republicans, couldn't get on board with. So it didn't get really a lot. The vote didn't really reflect the bipartisanship that, was behind the EITC, which is interesting. And that led for it to, not have immediate effect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, yeah, well, it is an interesting issue. And so now, what we find from an advocacy perspective, a lot of people want to look back and say, well, how come, let's recreate this coalition that was built around the EITC and to pass what it is we want to do next. And I kind of find myself in an area where I'm, warning people, listen, the EITC was a different issue because there was kind of broader political appeal for that specifically. Because, the business community in general likes tax credits, especially working people tax credits in that regard. And so, that's interesting. I think the other big theme from our standpoint, at least early on, if we look back to early in 2023, was really the governor's leading focus and then getting the legislature to follow on pushing a big chunks of money into this economic development idea and chasing these big SOAR projects. And now we're seeing some of that play out, in not such a great way, with Ford talking about scaling back and local opposition in these communities, the significant local opposition to some of these projects and other things. And I know that was frustrating for us and for a lot of other advocates as well, when, we saw this big opportunity of the state having surplus resources, but most of it being directed to the big corporate projects. Talk about that and how that dynamic played out a little bit, maybe from your end.
Yeah, I think, the economic development issue, like you really see a lot of tension in the Democratic Party over that. There is a split, among sort of I would say it's like a spectrum of how supportive people are for economic development, what they think, projects should focus on, but at the end of the day, I think if you have companies especially like Ford, which you mentioned, that, are here trying to, launch bigger projects in the state as a state lawmaker, as, someone of the governor's party, there's a lot of pressure, to help those projects move along and get new jobs in the state. So we saw, actually with the EITC bill, some automatic direction of corporate income taxes to this big SOAR fund, which is, the main driver for these really large projects. But it's, been a bumpy road. That bill was difficult to pass. There was one very strong Democratic holdout who has not voted for anything to that level of economic development and hasn't budged. So, the governor almost didn't get that main thing she did want. And then, like you mentioned, there's the local opposition in some of these areas. This is where politics sort of comes into play again. You saw it in 2022. There was a lot of Republican focus on, if some of these battery companies have ties to the Chinese Communist Party, are we giving, our land to China, these things that are happening. And it's really sparking some pretty vocal and strong local opposition. We've seen the township board recalled over things like this. And then, because with the UAW strike happening, Ford says, one of the most controversial projects we've had this year, Ford says, well, we might not, do the project to the level that we received, this huge, benefit incentive from the state for, now we're thinking we're going to scale this back, pointing, to the strike as one of the main reasons, EVs not doing, as well as originally expected. So it's certainly economic development this year. I think the governor got some wins on paper, but it, was a bumpier road than I think she was expecting, certainly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that last point you made is really the key. I mean, the strike was obviously a big issue that happened here, but the reality is people aren't buying the EVs, right, to what everyone expected. And so, we raced into this, the governor and got the legislature to go along racing in that we got to be out front and this is the future. This is the future. And now the global economy seems to be saying, well, maybe not so fast.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. And I think you're right. I mean, the I don't want to say chasm, but the divide within the Democratic caucus, there was a lot of talk early on from Democrats about how this wasn't the approach they wanted to take, but ultimately all of them, other than Representative Wegela, went along, right? And she got them in line. Now they're all saying, see, I didn't want to do this, and saying, or there's a faction, I guess, at least, that's saying we need to take a different approach. It'll be interesting moving forward. Now, I don't want, so it seems like we focused on some of the challenges right away. There were some good things, certainly we saw, especially when in terms of the budget, we saw some big investments in after school. The free school meals was a big focus of ours at Michigan's Children. And I was just on a call last week, seems to be working out even better than people expected. And I think is something that we'll really be able to build on. And we had some increased money for adult ed and other areas. So there were certainly some good things in the budget. We certainly, I think, tend to focus on those issues that we didn't get as much play on. One issue in particular where we seem like we struggled and are kind of frustrated as to why is around childcare. Childcare is a big issue here. Basically everybody across the political spectrum, when they're running for office, talk about childcare because they hear about it from their constituents in their communities. But we have not done a great job as a state in addressing that and really focusing or prioritizing investment and resources into childcare. So there was one of the big issues in childcare this year was what we spent a lot of energy bringing attention to what we called the childcare cliff. And this was really the federal money. So the federal government did a really good job of increasing significantly investments in childcare through the pandemic. And as those monies were about to expire, and those monies go to the state to support childcare efforts at the state level, everyone knew that this cliff was coming and the federal dollars were going to run out. And we were really pushing the state to offset some of this cliff by investing state resources into our childcare system. And as far as we can tell, we're the only state in the country with Democratic control, meaning a democratically controlled legislature and Democratic governor, that did not address or put state resources in to offset the impact of the cliff. And so that's one area in particular that we're really going to push forward on into 2024. What kind of from the, there's obviously a lot going on in the legislature at all times, but what do you owe that to? What do you think from your perspective? Why does childcare not seem to, on the campaign trail and in media bites, you hear the legislators talking about it, but it doesn't seem to resonate when it ultimately comes to making the decisions?
Yeah, I think, childcare is it just takes so much money. I think it's really the bottom line. I think if you were really going to solve the issue that people have with childcare, which is they can't really afford it, they can't find it. There aren't enough providers. The providers they can find are too expensive. It's hard to keep staff, especially, a lot of these facilities might pay, $12 or $13 an hour. And we're still in an era where you could go, work at a fast food restaurant, work at a retail location and make more than potentially what you could make, in a childcare facility, which might be, harder work. So I think that it's a very overwhelming issue. I think it would take a lot of money to sort of subsidize. And I think that's where I think that is probably the answer to the question. And that's why you kind of see it not being solved, because that is a difficult thing to do politically. I mean, certainly they've done some things, right? Like the governor has this, tri-share program. I think this is pretty limited in scope, but in certain areas with certain employers, the state, the county, and the employer splitting costs for childcare. You're seeing the Great Start readiness expansion. So the governor wants, universal preschool for all 4-year-olds, which certainly would cut off a year of, necessary childcare payments that someone might have to make. So you're seeing these smaller sort of incremental steps, but, the bottom line is, most families need childcare starting at 6 to 12 weeks until, the child is 4 or 5. And that could take, I don't think the state could do it on its own, but it would certainly take billions from the state and potentially, billions from the federal government to actually get to solve, a childcare issue for families.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that, the issue is overwhelming, and you hinted at a lot of the components of it, and the workforce is a big piece of it. But, we think there are some opportunities for some solutions. But I think, in the big picture standpoint, I think you're right. I think Governor Whitmer is probably more like 49 other governors in the country that are hoping and praying that the federal government will step in and really address this issue. And there was certainly efforts that we're a part of with our partners nationally at the federal level and partners from other states in trying to get those increased investments that we saw through the pandemic, continued. But we complain about Lansing. Washington's an absolute mess right now at the legislative level, certainly. So we don't see any real path for that to happen anytime soon in Washington. And so we're going to continue to try to push for this to become a bigger priority at the state level. But you're right. It's a big issue, but one that we think that more can be done on, and it's going to take everybody committing to it to make it happen. One other issue that, got a lot of attention this fall, and we really see a really growing and expanding advocacy effort around, and a big coalition that we're a part of and helping to lead, growing around, is the paid family and medical leave. And this is something the governor had kind of an interesting speech in I can't remember, I think it was in September, maybe August or September, where she kind of laid out her priorities for the fall after the budget was done. And called on the legislature to do some stuff. And this, got a lot of people's attention, certainly was interesting to us and a lot of our advocacy partners, but didn't seem to get, there's some movement in the legislature, and certainly some champions emerging in the legislature, but didn't really, get any real momentum during that shortened fall legislative session. But this effort is going to continue into 2024. What are you hearing, or what's kind of the inside word on paid leave from inside the Capitol?
Yeah, so the governor, called for this. You're right, at the end of August, before the legislature, came back in the fall, sort of set the tone for, what she wanted to see done next. So this paid family leave proposal, could be used to take care of like an elderly family member or a sick family member, or, it could be sort of a, maternity or paternity leave. Paid up to a certain amount. The details were very scarce. The governor didn't provide many. She kind of kicked this out and said, let's figure it out. So there were a couple bills already in the legislature, in the House and Senate. I think it was Senator Geis, and I don't recall who had it in the House. And, they were 12 weeks, but it really didn't get a ton. I think, most Democrats, including leadership, sort of support this on the surface level, right? Like, you ask them about it and they're like, this is a good idea. This could help the state. This could help a lot of families. I think, again, like so many things, the bottom line comes down to how would it work? How would the state pay for this? And this is where you see a lot of businesses and business groups like balking at this whole idea, really trying to put a pin in it as, an actual policy that could become law. I think in Minnesota recently did this, and it was, it's something like, I believe, a payroll tax that's kind of used to pay for that. That's sort of the expectation of what would happen here if Democrats really started, to move this in earnest. But I think, this would be a hard vote to do, hard policy to do before the election, potentially. We have the House up for election this year. They have 56, very tight majority. That's going to be a main goal of the governor, and House Speaker Tate is going to be keeping all 56 of those members. So to a certain extent, they're going to have to make a decision on, is this a winning issue for our vulnerable members if we do something like this and businesses are out there saying, no, this is bad, small businesses are going to close, or can we win on this because it is something that, will help, everyday people if something like this were to pass. I think that's probably what people are grappling with. I don't know what answer they've come up with, but we certainly haven't seen, a huge push to pass this so far. So that might, give us our answer on what it will look like next year.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think, we have these conversations with this coalition of advocates supporting this. And I think you've nailed it right on the head. I mean, I think there's this notion, or there's this nervousness from legislative leadership, particularly in the House, who are heading into an election, that, hey, let's just not rock the boat. If Trump's at the top of the ticket, we're going to slide through. Let's just go. And what we're trying to get them to understand is this is a winning issue, that this is something they should be campaigning on. If I'm running, for re-election as a House Democrat in a marginal seat or a vulnerable seat, I want to be able to say I did this and I passed this. I mean, this issue polls at over 80% anywhere here in Michigan and anywhere in the country. It's wildly popular across the political spectrum with voters and with people who would benefit from this policy. But the opposition is real. I mean, the business, the political entities that engage in political campaigns and fund campaigns for and against candidates on the right especially are very engaged on this. And it will be fascinating to watch, but I don't think the issue is going away. I think, Minnesota, was the 11th state. There's a number of other states that are considering it right now. This is not something that people are just going to be able to continuously walk away from, and we're going to continue to build on and push the effort forward. But it is Michigan's children and the fact that we think this would be great for kids and families aside, just from a pure political context, this will be a fascinating one to watch and to see. So, I mean, the other thing.
And if I could just add, really quickly, I just have another thought that, if you're talking about the governor who's nearing, she's kind of going into the second half almost of her term, if you're talking about a legacy for a Democratic governor who has really kind of encompassed the Democratic Party nationally, right? Like, she's gotten so much focus. I can't imagine she's going to lay off this issue, whether it's something that comes up in lame duck. But, I think she wants to have a big policy like this when she leaves office. If she can sort of steer the legislature to doing something kind of this impactful that really would touch, so many families that don't have access to something like this right now, I do think that has to be something that she's interested in and carrying on when she does leave office. So I feel like she'll make a big push, but we'll see.
I hope you're right. Because I would counter that to a little bit of effect with this governor has been very friendly to business.
Yeah.
As a Democratic governor, she's been very friendly to business and business interests throughout her tenure. And so this would be really the first that I can recall in a big way of, going counter to that or really taking them on, because the business community at large in general is going to be opposed to this. There's no middle ground for them on this. There's no getting them to neutral on this type of an issue and having it be effective in any way, shape, or form. I mean, you'll lose the advocates if you give in to what the business community would want to get to neutral. So this would be the first, I think, and I hope you're right, and I think it makes sense from a legacy standpoint. But this would be the first real effort at getting crosswise with the traditional business interests in the state. So that's another reason why I think it'll be fascinating to watch. So we talked about the politics. So let's dig into that a little bit here before we close out. So with narrow majorities in both the House and the Senate not up for election. So we come back with the same Senate makeup, same issue there, but the House up for election, and combine that with the fact that we're really starting the year at 54-54, with two House members having recently been elected to local mayorships in their communities. But those seats expected to be filled by Democrats by April or whenever the special date has been set here for the elections. But what do you think? I mean, talk to a little bit about that and how that is going to impact both the narrow majorities as they are, and then the fact that the House is heading into this election going to impact things heading into 2024.
Yeah, I think we're going to likely see a pretty slow couple of months. I think with the House at 54-54, the Democrats need, at least one Republican to vote yes to pass anything. And you're going to see, how the Republican leadership handles this. Are the Democrats able to peel off one or two votes? Republicans just going to stay united? No on everything. I think there's going to be a political question there for Republicans to answer in the House of like, is it better for us just to block everything, or how much can we really get from the Democrats on certain proposals, or are they just going to wait us out? So both seats that are up for a special election are safe Dem seats. So a Dem's going to win, but that election isn't until April 16th. So they won't be back at 56 until then. Certainly Democrats can get a lot of things ready to go. They can talk about the budget, but it's going to be hard to pass, certainly anything that is a strong Democratic priority. You might see some cats and dogs, like just smaller kind of things move through that can get 100 or so votes. But anything controversial is likely off the table, and maybe even anything even slightly controversial might be off the table too, depending on how Republicans want to play their hand here.
Yeah, and the interesting thing too is kind of through a quirk in the rules that we don't really have a shared power dynamic even for these first few months, because it is 54-54, right? If it was 55-55, they'd have to restructure committees and everything else. So that actually helps the Democrats and able to maintain their committee structure. So, I mean, one scenario is we could really just see a bottleneck on the House floor, right? Where we could see things continue to move through the Senate, even move through committee on the House side, but then just kind of get bottlenecked on the House floor until they're able to get these new members seated and push through. But that, I mean, the interesting part about that is, and so then, I mean, what most people would view as those would be somewhat controversial issues that are going to be party line votes. Well, then you got them all teed up even closer to the election, right? When these new members, these two new people that just got elected, their first week are going to be voting on 50 things that are party line votes right off the bat. That's not always the best case scenario as a new member. And so that's an interesting, I think, to see how that plays out is going to be fascinating as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think as soon as they're in there, and they'll win like their primaries at the end of January. So I imagine the House Democratic leadership will be like, okay, now you need to learn everything now. You're not waiting until April. Like the day that you win, like as soon as that election is certified, you are on the floor and we are, starting marathon sessions. But like you mentioned, because it is an election year, usually, the House is not in very much in the summer. And then in the fall, it's very slow. We might see another kind of change in the schedule and how it would traditionally work, because they are likely going to have to wait 4 months to really get going. So the summer, the fall might be a little bit busier for an election year than what we've seen in the past.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Never a dull moment, right?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Well, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank Alethia for this great conversation. We really appreciate you making the time around your work and holiday schedule to join us and to help our listeners kind of understand the ins and outs of what happened here in 2023 and what we can expect moving forward. To you and our listeners out there, happy holidays, peace, and good wishes to all of you. Until next time, I'm Matt Gillard, and this is Speaking for Kids. Find out more about this program and others by visiting our website at michiganschildren.org. And don't forget to sign up for our bulletin when you get there. Thanks.
You've been listening to Speaking for Kids, the podcast for Michigan's children with host Matt Gillard. Thanks for joining us. To explore these and other issues relevant to our state's children, youth, and families, and to build your advocacy muscle, go to our website at www.michiganschildren.org. You'll find links and news about past and future podcast topics under our Resource tab and action alerts under the Take Action tab. Find and like us on Facebook and Twitter. Terry Bannis and Stephen Wallace produced this podcast. Contact them with your questions and ideas for other topics. Michigan's Children is a nonprofit advocacy organization, an independent voice working to reduce disparities in child outcomes from cradle to career through policy change.